Okay, hello. Today we'll talk about a very interesting Japanese architect, and Japan, as you know, has many very interesting architects and challenging. And Togo Murano is a little bit less known architect, but this is almost a virtue, I would say, because at a time when excessive publicity creates, a significant number of star architects. Togo Murano, although he deserves to be very well known, is a little bit less known. And this is unfair. We'll try to correct this situation. But in order to correct this situation, I have to be able to move forward with my presentation. And strangely, I can't. Okay, now I can. Togo Murano, 1891-1984. Let's read a little bit about him. Togo Murano, as you see, was born on May 15th, 1891, and died in 1984, was a Japanese architect. Although his formative years were between 1910 and 1930, he remained active in design throughout his life, and at the time of his death was responsible for over 300 completed projects. Frank Lloyd Wright had a little more than 500 completed projects, but Togo Murano 300, that's quite a number. Although his work lacked a distinctive singular style, he was recognized as a master of the modern interpretation of the Sukiya style. His work included large public buildings as well as hotels and department stores, and he has been recognized as one of Japan's modern masters. Togo Murano. The scope of Murano's work throughout his career covered many styles of architecture. He was influenced by Japanese and Western architecture, but did not commit himself to one particular ideology. And I would say this was his main virtue. Although the sheer volume of his work led him to be criticized as simply a commercial architect, he always gave top priority to the requirements of his clients. He was the author of a few publications in his lifetime. This included Staying Above Style. So this is in contradiction with what whoever the author of the Wikipedia entry was. So he wrote Staying Above Style in 1919 and The Economic Environment of Architecture in 1926. In 1931, Looking While Moving, he railed against Le Corbusier and the modern movement and declared that the skyscrapers of Manhattan were the way forward. Well, this was the man, Togo Murano, as you can see, a serious man, intense man, as many Japanese are. And I wonder, why is Japan so rich in the field of architecture? Why are there so many very important Japanese architects? I mean, this country has the largest number of Pritzker Prize laureates, Japan. Yatsuga Take Art Museum, I mean, from the very first picture, look at the ceiling. You know, it's very unusual. When was it built? I don't include the year, but that's bad. Sorry, it would have helped. Anyway, a very interesting ceiling, no? It seems done with textile, no? With the fabric. Well, if so, then we can only congratulate him, because we just discussed about the fact that architecture, in fact, all derivatives of the word architecture come from that very old word in the Proto-Indo-European language, text, which means to weave. An interesting idea, no? To bring the textiles, the fabric, in the building in such a way. And the building is interesting outside as well. And not to mention the beautiful landscape with the great trees all around it. And sculptures in between the trees. Very, very nice. Culture and nature together. Umeda ventilation towers. Now you'll be surprised. Very prosaic function, no ventilation towers, but he created giant sculptures. Look at them. You know, I mean, why not? Who would have expected some ventilation towers to look like this? And look at them at night. Togo Murano. They are primal, they are atavistic, they are Ur architecture, they are fundamentalists, they are you know, indeed very sculptural, very strong. Maybe I am exalted now because I need some good ventilation in the space I'm talking to you from because of the dust, which is unbearable here. Anyway. So we see around these ventilation towers some buildings of modernity, but the ventilation towers are the most distinguished architecturally speaking. Takarazuka Catholic Church, a very provocative church, to say the least. I mean, even Ronchamp looks timid compared to this one. I'm not trying to say that this is a better building than Ronchamp, and it might, well, when was it built? It doesn't say. Again, another minus for my presentation. But you could say that there might be some, if it was built, and I imagine it was built after Ronchamp, or I could be wrong, I have to check this. But I look at the, you know, the piercings of the wall, and it reminds me of the southern wall of Ronchamp. But besides, it's a very provocative building. Togo Murano. The Miyako Hotel in Kyoto. Now here we see another side of Togo Murano, the, you know, the one with the affection and knowledge of what we call tradition. And in this respect is a remarkable building. Sorry, just a second. I have to turn off the refrigerator, which makes an unbearable noise. You probably hear it. Okay. But I noticed something, you know, and I maybe a book can be written about it. Very often, Japanese architects, towards the end of their lives, become more conventional and sometimes more commercial. And I think this is a great disappointment. I know some great architects who became very, very intensely unique, avant-garde, if you want. And then in later years, they slowed down, so to speak. Now, since I have troubles with the dust here, I could comment a little bit on the Zen gardens of the Zen tradition, you know, in Japan. I mean, you know, for the Japanese, every particle of sand is important, and you know, it's something that most people abstain from showing an interest towards. But I think we can learn a lot from the Japanese to value every square inch or every square centimeter, or even, I exaggerate now, every square millimeter of this world, if we are to save it from disaster, and if we are to save ourselves from disaster, psychological disaster, divorcing ourselves from nature and from contemplation. It's a great museum. It's not, alarmingly innovative aesthetically, but the integration between building and nature is almost as good as at Katsura. World Peace Memorial Cathedral. Now, this is a very seminal, a very interesting work by Togo Murano. It was built just after the Second World War, which Japan lost, and tragically so if we consider just the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The World Peace Memorial Cathedral, Hiroshima, Japan, 1953, architect Togo Murano. Let's read a little bit about it because it's a very interesting building. I don't know how to explain to you, but Zoom is shortening my life because there is something here that is blocking the third line and I cannot read it, but you can. The roughness of all the materials reflects the designer's desire to create a mood of religious and historical austerity. Murano's articulation of the volumetric, and then you read because I can't, because Zoom in its great generosity is blocking me the third line. And I can't even explain to you because what you see is not what I see. Anyway, leaves little doubt about the influence of Auguste Perret's architecture on the design. Auguste Perret, a great master of concrete. And as in the case of Perret, such austerity is challenged by a variety of elements that sometimes subtly, sometimes more noticeably enrich the experience. Among them, the various historical references are the most important. The circular dome over the sanctuary and the uniquely roofed small cylindrical chapels on both sides of the main volume recall Byzantine architecture, while the small clover leaf-shaped windows seem to be Murano's interpretation of Romanesque or wall-paint openings. The simple but lofty 60-meter high interior with its flat, densely ribbed ceiling and massive plastered and arched walls is even more suggestive of Romanesque prototypes. Light filtering through the stained glass windows and occasionally hitting the colorful mosaic image above the altar intensifies the solemn mood. Now let's see if we can also see some images. Unfortunately, that's a problem with Japanese architecture. From my experience, they either have images which are very small resolution like this, and they are small and hard to see, or they have with a huge resolution and they, cripple less adequate laptops like mine. But this is the building, and I like it very much because on one hand, yes, it's austere, even severe, but it has subtleties of detail which makes it very, very interesting. This is the model of the building, and it's a building which assumes history in a very explicit way, almost literal way, but also the very modern, austerity. You could almost say it's a brutalist work, but nuanced by certain delicate details or even ornaments, like you see this window here, shaped like a flower, or very small things that indeed bring sensitivity to an otherwise almost brutalist architectural work. And look what's going on at the altar there. What is that diagonal? Maybe that diagonal is the diagonal of doubting, maybe even doubting that peace is indeed possible on this earth. the war in Ukraine shows clearly that it doesn't seem possible. It doesn't matter the horrible memories of the Second World War. Humans do not learn, as Rem Koolhaas said. The humans do not learn. We do not learn. The end of the war in Ukraine will end one day, and will continue to have wars. It's incredible. Look at the plan of the building. You know, it's not a spectacular plan. It's not a spectacular building. If you compare it, let's say, with the chapel of Notre Dame du Haut in Ronchamp by Le Corbusier, there you have fluidities, curves. Here is a rectangular building, a prism, but with these little spaces that create something else. You know, these things. What are these things? And this is also reflected in the aesthetics of the exterior, like here, you know, at the bottom. Also, the reference in the text that I read to Byzantine architecture. This is also interesting because you wouldn't expect Byzantine echoes in Japanese architecture. So I like this building very much because it is on one hand a modern building, but on the other hand, almost brutally so, and on the other hand, is connected with what we call history. Not easy to do something like this, and I think Togo Murano deserves all the appreciation. And the interior also is dramatic. It has some, narrative architecture, the stained glass windows, which are maybe not, I mean, they could be beautiful, but they are not very, idiosyncratically, creative. But this diagonal, which I don't know what it is, throws me in disarray because it shows me how unconventional this architect was. Also, the reference to Romanesque architecture is rather unusual because in the history of the last few centuries, there were more common references to the Gothic architecture, like in the 19th century, or even more to Renaissance architecture, but not to Romanesque architecture. While even in this respect, he is original. But then, it's nothing Romanesque about these openings in the wall. So he has continuity, but he also has innovation. Very interesting architect, Togo Murano, and he deserves a study, and reflecting on his work. Even in terms of tectonics, you look how he, employed those so-called accidental bricks that come out of the wall a little bit. That shows a certain sensitivity, an appreciation for what we call the accident or aleatory, deviant architectural gestures. (1953), Togo Murano. I mean, these little details, these piercings, in the massivity of the wall, they bring sensitivity to the building, and with a certain discretion. But this discretion is immensely important. They are necessary there. Otherwise, the building, it seems. I'm not sure if this was the building destroyed. No, because it was built after the war. These are images of the war, what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the deadly bombings. And, the cathedral that he built was, commissioned in order to advocate peace. But as we can see, the humans cannot live in peace. Very sad. Very interesting cathedral, in my opinion. Because it is interesting, because it again, you recognize the prisms, which you could identify as being rationalistic, but because of the other elements that are crystallized in this building in no way can be considered a rationalist work of architecture. No. And even the employment of the arches inspired by Romanesque architecture are almost unique, I would say, in modern architecture. And I appreciate an architecture which avoids finishes, no finishes. We see the exposed concrete and we see the exposed brickwork. And this is architecture. You understand how the building came into being, you understand how it was made. And only the pedantic and the timid would object that it doesn't have finishes. We don't need finishes, we need truth. And the building seems to say the same thing. As you can see, I show a lot of images because I do admire this building. It's true. And it's not white. I think this is a virtue. I remember when I first visited Ronchamp by Le Corbusier, I was actually disappointed by the fact that it was too white, too clean. Now, maybe it was refurbished, it was repainted, whatever, but it was too septic, too clean, too white. I don't think a church should be so white. This bothers me a little bit, even in the two churches that Palladio built in Venice, Il Redentore and San Giorgio Maggiore. I think they are too luminous and too white. For me, a church, the sacred should be mysterious, dark, even dark. Tanimura Art Museum, Togo, Murano. Another interesting building, you know, I mean, it reminds us of the ventilation towers that we saw earlier. Very sculptural, no? Very telluric, very heavy. And it's not an art depot, you know, it shows that, you know, it's a fortress of protection. It protects the artworks, but it's not an art depot, as, for example, one or two museums by Herzog and de Meuron seem to say. I refer particularly to the one at Bitra. Why is Togo Murano not known? Because I don't think he's an inferior architect to, for example, Tadao Ando. Well, he lived, you know, he was older than Tadao Ando, but I think he deserves to be known and admired. A primal art museum, heavy, dark even. And then the landscape around it with the utmost care taken taken, into consideration. Very nice, because it matters a lot what is happening around the building. I mean, there are subtleties here, that need appreciation. And it's a beautiful interplay between the massivity of the fortress-like art museum and the, gentle configuration of the landscape, in which man had a role, of course, because it is a controlled landscape by human intervention. Togo Murano. And the interior. Well, here we have some whiteness, because it seems whiteness is unavoidable at the interior of an art museum. So we can contemplate the art better. By the way of art, and by the way of the Proto-Indo-European language, the oldest definition I found of the word art is the following one. Again, in the Proto-Indo-European language, art, I read in English, art equals bridge equals God. This is what the ancients thought of art, that art is a bridge, is about connecting, and art equals God. Art equals bridge equals God. I think we should think about this. And also, when Vincent Scully, a very important scholar for architecture, who was friends even with Louis Kahn, when he wrote about Louis Kahn, one article on Louis Kahn had this just two words that he borrowed from a British writer, Froster. Only connect. That's it. Only connect. But this connects with that primeval definition of art. Art equals bridge equals God. But what is a bridge? A bridge is about connecting the two sides of the river, for example. So art means to connect. To do art means to connect. It's about communication. It's about bringing people together, or bringing together culture and nature, like in this case. Some headquarters. Now look at this building. It's a wild building. I mean, let's confess it. It's some kind of a business, an office building by Togo Murano. That this is the most surreal elevation of an office building. Who ever saw such an office building with such an elevation? But I find it very intriguing and interesting. It's not a giant office building, but it's unique. It has character, it has ornament, as we talked about ornament before. It has geometry, and it has rotations, and it has, of course, other angles than the 90 degrees angle. And it is very Japanese somehow. But it's also, I don't know, I don't know how to describe it. What you see is what you get. But it's an interesting building, is it not? Togo Murano. I mean, with all due respect, but the buildings, for example, by Tadao Ando are rather predictable. Once you begin to know his way of doing architecture, you know what to expect. In this case, this architect takes us by surprise. With the impurity or hybridity of his design, or of his architecture, his work. You can look in many places all over the world. You are not going to see many office buildings look like this. No. And it's mainly this elevation. Now, Japan Lutheran Theological Seminary from 1969, a different building, but this one I would say equally impressive in its own way. It's more polished, it's cleaner than that cathedral dedicated to peace built in 1953 in Hiroshima, but it's a fine building, this one as well. I would imagine even Richard Meyer would agree with it. Togo Murano. The interplay between light and shadow is well known, being appreciated not just by Le Corbusier, but by many others. And we can include now Togo Murano. So there is this interesting website, you probably know it, Architecture Misfits, and it has you know a presentation of Togo Murano, and I suggest to you to open it and read it and study it. From there, I took this short text. Some of the buildings of Togo Murano are incomprehensible and indescribably beautiful at the same time. It makes me want, you know, the author of the article says, it makes me want to believe in architecture as art. My personal cynic tells me that positing the existence of a higher logic is primitive human response to anything resisting easy comprehension, but still, I like what he wrote. Because we do need idealism. And, you know, an architect like Togo Murano is saying implicitly through his works the same thing. Some of Togo Murano's design resist not only easy comprehension, but sustained rational analysis as well. In the end, no framework for understanding presents itself other than one person's will for it to be like that. I'm used to saying that in a bad way for things I dislike, but I'm not accustomed to saying it for things I'm drawn to. Again, this was written by the author of this article. Murano's aesthetic sensibility is connected to his mastery of Japanese architecture, Sukiya style. We can think of Sukiya as classical Japanese architecture that's been loosened up to admit idiosyncrasies. And yes, these idiosyncrasies create something unique, something different from you know, unexpected architectural configurations. So we shouldn't be afraid of what is idiosyncratical at all. Now, auditorium, sorry, the fifth letter is a T, auditorium of the Nisei Theater, of another, you know, fantastic, surreal work by Togo Murano. Look at the ceiling. I don't know when it was built, and I regret I didn't include the year of the construction. But look at the ceiling of this auditorium. And this was years, many years before what we call parametric design. I wonder if Herzog and de Meuron knew or know the work, and maybe they do, of Togo Murano, because what we see here on this ceiling of the inside of the auditorium, we see outside on the Philharmonia building in Hamburg, on the roof. This sort of thing that here we find at the interior of the auditorium. A remarkable ceiling, you could say just a ceiling. Well, it's not just a ceiling, and the ceiling does matter. We saw in the first work that I showed here in this presentation, there's the, equally interesting and engaging ceiling done with fabric. Here is not with fabric, but again, the ceiling is important. We should avoid, just flat white ceilings forever and ever and ever. Murano's refusal to see the inside and outside as the same thing is eminently sensible. If you want to be outside, you go outside and sit on a seat and enjoy being outside. And when you are tired of that, you go inside, or if you wish, gaze outside through a window. This is a remarkable observation, because we know that, especially in modern architecture, we became almost obsessed with eliminating the frontier between inside and outside. Some of the greatest modern masters wanted exactly this, to eliminate the frontier, the separation between the inside and the outside. But look here, Murano doesn't want to do that. He says, the author says, if you want to be outside, you just go outside and sit on a seat and enjoy being outside. But if you are tired of that, you go inside and you can gaze the outside through a window. And this reminds me of a writing by a Romanian poet who lives and works in the United States, Andrei Codrescu, who once used the expression, the disappearance of the outside. When we dissolve completely the frontier between the inside and the outside disappears, and paradoxically, even the interior disappears. They both disappear. So maybe it's worth reflecting on this, and maybe the return to small windows would reactivate the individualization of the inside and the outside. So to have the outside as outside and to have the inside as an inside. Interesting observation by the author of this article on Togo Murano. And this is the website I took these quotations from, Misfits Architecture, and is a very good website, very interesting and engaging. So if you search for it on the web, and you can find entries on many interesting architects, less known. Misfits. That's it. So this was the presentation on Togo Murano today. Thank you.